What's going on, everybody? Hope you're having a good day. So the day has finally arrived where my credibility goes right down the toilet, because with a recent video game release this year, and it was something I was looking forward to, a lot of people out there said this game would have a small cult following, but for the most part, the consensus did not like Wanted Dead. And for a while, I was in that group. I straight up just wrote it off after playing the game for only an hour. At first, I found the combat to be rather insufferable, slow, and clunky. I thought the voice acting was pretty much a joke, and the presentation was lackluster and unoriginal at best. But after that grueling hour and a half to 2 hours of the first level, and I know that if a first level isn't quite good, then maybe the game won't be as good. Well, after getting used to the game and trying over and over to get into it, after that first level of repetitive cover system, gunplay, and swordplay, and with my teammates consistently saying, "Grenade!" all the damn time, I thought I would never even beat the first level of this game. But here I am, after a night of playing this game non-stop, and just searching the lore on the internet more and more, I found myself actually liking Wanted Dead a lot. And I know it's a little weird, but then again, I do like games like Killer 7, No More Heroes, and I guess those games are in the category of weird. But I really wanted to exclaim today that Wanted Dead is actually not that bad, and it sort of grew on me. And I didn't want to be that guy, but apparently I am that guy who ultimately just really loves the style of this game. And the story is just actually everything I wanted in a sort of cop mystery action game. And in some parts, this game presents something that most cop suspense stories and movies don't even present. But I'm going to start with the basics, because there are things that I really love about this game, but also things that I didn't like so much. But weirdly enough, the things I didn't like about Wanted Dead sort of had a purpose for being there. So the first things first, and the most important part of Wanted Dead, and that is the combat. At first, the combat flow didn't really make a lot of sense, since a lot of this game seemed like a typical stop and pop shooter. But initially, while seeing a lot of the first trailers, I liked the way the gunplay looked. It seemed really slick, like something from a Chow Yun-fat movie. And that older title, Stranglehold, if you've ever played that. And of course, at first, the combat just seemed a tad too slow and just out of place, since all I was doing when I first started it was stopping and popping initially. Because if you see the training simulation in the beginning, the main focus was shooting. But then they show you a little bit more on how to fight with your sword and your gun. And the combination of those two is surprisingly effective. What I call the combat after playing for, well, the entire game is step-by-step combat. First, you lay a few shots on them to break their guard, and then you slice them up a bit, maybe take out their left arm or right arm so the enemy is incapacitated. And then you shoot them a little more and move on to the next enemy, and keep an eye on the one that you try to weaken first. It's sort of like this strange, almost turn-based system of a sort of strategic sword and gunplay mixed together, and by the end of the game, mixed together beautifully. And it's exactly kind of what I wanted from the game since the first trailer that I saw. But after the initial hour and a half of combat, when they just make you shoot enemies and you hear your teammates shout "grenade" for a half an hour straight to the point of comedic relief, I started to know some kind of pattern to this combat. And it seemed like they just wanted you to get used to the enemy's movements. And so I kept getting used to the enemy's movements to the point I was confident enough to go up to the enemies and just fight them. Now, the first time I tried this, it wasn't so good. I had to get used to the timing of the sword. And also, the gun I was using, which was, I'm assuming, a Glock, since they are police officers, but then again, there isn't anything conventional about these police officers, since they are called the Ghost Team, which is kind of a badass name. Strangely enough, you can actually customize every single weapon. But just like Armored Core, you have to think about what you want to customize, because some upgrades change the stopping power, some the initial accuracy, and just the weight of the weapon is different. So the timing is different. Everything strangely goes goes together, even the customizations of your rifle and your handgun. So as the combat started to grow on me, it was actually growing as a whole. But this wasn't the most exciting part about the combat. It's when you chain finishers, and when they actually introduce finishers. The enemy glows a slight white hue, and then you can press Y and B to finish them off. And I thought, okay, they're probably just gonna like cut off their head or maybe shoot them in the face or something. No, it was a full-on Chow Yun-Fat movie where you grapple them, you jump on them, and then twist them to the ground and have them in this kind of locked position, shoot them. And then if you have some kind of other enemy that's also in a position where you can finish them, you can chain your finishers. And I found that that is truly where the combat shines, when you're fighting multiple enemies and it seems hopeless. And that's really how it is in real life. You have to be strategic, and you can go down in a few punches just like anybody else. But the thing that matters the most is what kind of attacks you chain and when you chain them. So while fighting 3 enemies, hitting one with the sword, popping another in the side with my gun, and you can't use your rifle in a quick way like you do with your handgun. So you have to use your handgun while doing a lot of close quarters combat. And you could skip over to the next enemy, cut their leg off with your sword so you can incapacitate them while you get the other guy. And if you chain everything perfectly, all of the enemies you're fighting will start to glow that white hue so you can get that sweet, sweet finisher with all 3. And it is incredibly satisfying. Somehow, that slow, clunky combat is extremely satisfying by the end. And also, depending on what enemy, where the enemy is, and what kind of condition the enemy is in, your finishers will be different. So there are tons of combinations of finishers. It's not just one finisher to rule them all. There are, I think I counted, more than 30 finishers based on what kind of location you're in, what kind of enemy you're fighting. I remember at a certain time when I was up to the 2nd level, which is awesome by the way, I kind of lost count how many different finishers I actually saw. And that's impressive. I haven't seen that with any game. Even with Ninja Gaiden 2, with those obliteration techniques, they kind of become repetitive after a certain amount of time, especially around 30 to 40 minutes. But after 30 to 40 minutes of fighting in this game, and it is truly a battle of nutrition, you don't really see a lot of the same finishers. It's all different depending on what kind of weapon the enemy's carrying, everything like that. It sort of reminds me of Resident Evil 6's combat, which was amazing. And that was the only thing amazing about it. But yeah, the combat in Wanted Dead is magnificent. I love it. I actually didn't think I would like it, but then again, with games like Dark Souls, I hated the combat at first. But because they were doing something ambitious with Dark Souls at first, since your character is so slow and clunky, but there's a purpose to that, I can't help but feel like Wanted Dead also had that same purpose. And it helps the ambiguity of the action a bit. You don't really know what the enemy is going to do in that time that you're swinging your sword. And swords are not light. A lot of games make them seem light. But refreshingly, in Wanted Dead, the sword looks and feels heavy, like a sword should. Because a sword can cut off your limbs. It just takes a while to swing it. And yeah, at first with the cutscenes, I thought, hey, yeah, they seem a bit basic and kind of boring, and the voice actors don't really seem like they know what they're doing. And everybody's crass and shallow and obnoxious. And that was in the first 30 minutes. But the more I play, the more I start to realize that, wow, these characters actually have something good to say. And randomly, some characters will just go in a heart-to-heart spree. And they're just so deep and ridiculously deep at times, actually, to the point I just sit there and think, yeah, that's actually pretty true. Whoever wrote this has most likely been through these kind of situations. I thought the fact that every character was so ridiculously honest was so refreshing to watch and hear throughout the game, and I just couldn't wait until I saw another cutscene. I just ate them up. I just love every single cutscene. I didn't think that they were cheesy at all. I thought they were just being honest about what they were going through. And because of that, it made the characters very interesting to me. I actually really love the characters in Wanted Dead. I thought they were more interesting than most protagonists in Japanese action, gun and swordplay games, I guess. Like, say, Ninja Gaiden. He's a man of very little words and not very interesting. But the main characters in Wanted Dead were actually pretty cool. I thought they were, of course, strange, but I like strange, so that's a point from me. And as the story goes on, you start to see some tension between some characters, and I thought that was kind of cool. There was actual development happening. I thought the story was entertaining, and I really have nothing to complain about, especially for the fact that when you find random files, it cuts to a whole ass cutscene that's very movie-esque and has some kind of deep meaning to it. It's just a random file that you find in your boss's office, and it cuts to this insane cop suspense film. It's incredible. You gotta try this game, especially for the story. Just give it a chance. And yeah, the graphics can be underwhelming at first, but it almost feels like a different team made the first level, because after the first level, the level design becomes more and more unique and just fun to look at. I thought this game was very beautiful at times, especially during the cutscenes, and there's some shots that are set up that have the perfect lighting and angles. It just seems like the director of this game kind of wanted to make a cop drama film, and it shows. I'm a big fan of the cinematography in this game. Now let's get to brass tacks, the not so good things. Now, I wouldn't say there are bad things in this game, but if I were to go over some of the not so good things, this game desperately needs a freaking waypoint, because instead, it merely describes the current objective, like go to A or B exit now. Well, I haven't seen A or B exit, so I don't know what the frick you're talking about, man. A lot of the times I really wish that this game had a waypoint or two. I just couldn't find my way for about 10 minutes. Luckily, the stages aren't that big, and they are laid out pretty simply, to the point you can kind of guess where the exit or where A or B item would be. But sometimes it's just like, hey, get the grenade launcher. And the grenade launcher is in this random part of the stage on the floor, shining a slightly different color from the rest of the weapons. There's no waypoint pointing to it. It's just in a random location. So that feels kind of cheap in comparison to the rest of the game. They should have had a few waypoints here and there. Maybe they just didn't know how to do it. And I thought that was not so good to have, but there's a lot of the times where it ramps up the suspense because you're just looking for this item while a giant spider robot's chasing you, and it sort of makes it more exciting sometimes. I don't think that really has a purpose, so that's why I counted it as the not so good things in this game. And sometimes the combat can feel a little cheap. Like if you pick up a chainsaw and you try to slice at somebody and everyone's just throwing grenades at you. Grenade, grenade, grenade! And you can't do anything about it because you're just too busy in this animation. Feels kind of cheap, but I found that it's purposeful because the chainsaw is pretty much a one-shot kill with any enemy. And I mean any enemy, even the special ones. So you have to kind of risk vulnerability with this specific weapon. And with other things like the constant grenades, or when one of your teammates say, on your side, or something like that. The reason why they say that and try to back you up is because you're doing something wrong. You're taking cover too much, or you're too far from the enemy. There's actually a certain distance that's really good to be at because the grenades will affect your enemies as well. I remember one of the grenades bounced off the wall and actually hit another guy, and they stopped throwing the grenade at some point. But when the enemy does throw a grenade, and that's going to be a lot of times, I don't even remember getting a grenade and throwing it myself, except for the grenade launcher. For a lot of this game, you are going to be dodging grenades if you're a little too far from the enemy or if you're taking cover for the most part, because you are supposed to be making your actions change from stopping and popping to sword and gunplay. Mixing up your combat from those two will confuse the enemy a little bit because the enemy is very resilient. And that's another part of the combat that feels a little cheap. Sometimes the enemies do seem like they are very spongy, but I think spongy is the wrong word. I think the enemies are resilient. They can take a lot of damage. And they kind of explain this in storyline and say that A or B enemy may look a certain way, but they're a lot tougher than they seem. And a lot of the enemies are fully armored. So a lot of those aspects I listed off, like the grenades and spongy enemies, kind of have a purpose. They are supposed to present some kind of challenge to the player. You can't just go up to an enemy, take them out, and there you go. The enemies are all gone and the threat is neutralized. It's supposed to be a kind of decision that you make and a risk that you take, including taking cover. The game is very focused on directing you into a certain angle to have the best time possible. And for the most part, I think the developers did a great job in directing you to a certain type of gameplay. And in that certain circle of gameplay that they want you to be in, you can do a lot of things. And there are a lot of different variations of combat that you can take advantage of, like countering, and you can even counter with your gun. It's a little strange, but when you do that, it's always exhilarating. It just makes me want to see a sequel to Wanted Dead and to see what they can do with the combat and how they could evolve the countering system, especially because I think when it comes to countering with your sword, it can be a bit difficult. Of course it is. Otherwise it would be just like like Metal Gear Rising, you could just counter whenever the heck you want. But everything in the game seems like it needs to be earned, which I also find refreshing and sort of Dark Souls-like, where one enemy seems impossible to beat. You just need to strategize, customize, just like Armored Core, and you will eventually find yourself getting used to these variations of enemies that are coming at you left and right. And given everything, I think the developer did the best that they could with what they had. I mean, it didn't seem like they had a very big budget for this game, but the cutscenes showed that there's a lot of potential for this studio with whichever budget that they had. And sometimes I couldn't believe the quality of cutscene that they included. They even showed animated cutscenes as well. But my time with this game wasn't without its hurdles and just pain, because there was some crashing and freezing that happened not too frequently, but a decent amount, to the point that I was sitting there for around an hour trying to fix whatever was wrong with the PC port. I eventually did get it fixed, but it took me almost an hour and a half just to fix this issue with my game. But that should be a testament to how I feel about Wanted Dead. I tried to get it to work for almost an hour and a half because I actually liked it. And I started to realize that after an hour. I thought to myself, why do I want to play this game so much? Why am I trying so hard to get access to this game again? Do I actually like this game? Am I one of those people now? One of the cult followers of Wanted Dead? Apparently I am. I never thought I would be one of those guys, but after giving it my time and patience, I found that this game has a lot to offer. And it's not just some shallow project made by some random studio. It's now one of my favorite titles that I played in recent times because it's so different and just refreshing at times. It's unlike any other game I've played in the past 5 years, and I think that's a great thing. I think you just need to get used to it, and the combat that it presents is very different. A lot of people do say the aiming in the game isn't very good, but it's very snappy. It's meant to be snappy and accurate, and you have to pay attention to the customizations that you put on your rifle, because that will affect accuracy as well. Maybe you're putting the wrong customizations. It's kind of like Armored Core, but people pay attention to Armored Core in a different way now because From Software has made such a big name for themselves. But Soleil, or Soleil, however you say the name of the studio, seemed to have worked on the Dead or Alive and Ninja Gaiden series, and at first I thought, okay, they're just using the clout from those games to get some attention, because clearly, based on what everyone's saying, this game can't be as good as Dead or Alive or Ninja Gaiden. And honestly, it's not as good as Ninja Gaiden, and definitely not as good as the Dead or Alive series. But it's something different that I needed to experience, and it's something that I hope continues. I really love the characters in this game, which had kind of strange names that I'm having trouble pronouncing, so I just won't say it. But the main character's name is Lieutenant Hannah Stone, and I actually found her characterization interesting and the way she went about things. And she had this thick accent, which I found a little difficult to relate to, but later on, her mannerisms and the way she talked kind of just ended up making sense to me. And upon further research, I found out that Stephanie Justin actually made the voice for the blacksmith, as they call her. And that was the character laying down the most realistic advice I've ever heard. And I think some of that advice came from her personally. But her character's name is absolutely ridiculous to try to pronounce, but she pretty much plays the person who customizes all of your weapons. And you talk to her very frequently during the game. Now, if you don't know who Stephanie Justin is, she is the person who played Quiet from Metal Gear Solid 5, and I had no idea until now. But her character stood out the most to me while playing, and she's actually one of my most favorite characters, and the reason I find the story so interesting in the first place. So that's actually pretty awesome. Now, I like the game even more. But yeah, Wanted Dead. Have you guys tried it? Are you still thinking about giving it a chance? Because I've been back and forth with this game all year, and I finally gave it a chance, and I did not regret it. It didn't just blow me away right away. It took some time to simmer that feeling a bit until I realized and appreciated just how refreshing and awesome this game actually is. And I guess after everything I've talked about, I'm assuming you guys want me to rate this game. Well, some games are just hard to rate. They're like fine wine or old films. You just have to give them a chance, and sometimes you appreciate them, sometimes you won't. But if I was absolutely forced, tied down with a gun to my head to give this game a score, it would be a 7.5 out of 10. I think this game is a lot of fun and has a lot of potential, especially if they make a sequel. Now, Soleil, or whatever your studio name is, get on it. But let me know if you've given this game a chance and what you think about it, honestly and openly. And if after watching this video you still have some questions or are still hesitant to try it, let me know in the comments. And I hope you guys have a great one. Thanks for watching. Later.